I have two things to say before we get started. First is I'm a quarter-time pastor, children's pastor here, but also I'm the facilities manager, the sexton, and in my earlier years, a rain like this would have caused me great anxiety because of our flooding issues, but thanks be to God, I count it as grace that I'm not just sweating bullets up here, worried the basement and other properties are flooding. And two, as Pastor Dave mentioned earlier, given the vote to involuntarily remove Awaken Covenant Church from the roles of the Covenant Church, I prepared this sermon, obviously, during the week prior to that, but maybe I would have chosen the Matthew text about welcoming Christ, giving a cup of cold water. But I'd count it as grace that I'm not importing all of that into that, so receive this sermon as I've prepared it for you. Pray with me. God, thank you for meeting us here, welcoming us here, giving your creation life through sun and rain. And I pray that you would give us all life through your word, that the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts would be pleasing to you. Amen. So, while studying and wrestling with Romans 6 this week, I was reminded of a show on Apple Plus. Has anyone here watched Shrinking on Apple TV? Okay, a couple of you, all right. For those of you who have not, I will not spoil it. I'm not saying much more than is in the trailer for this show. But Shrinking is about a team of psychologists. One of them is played by Harrison Ford, but he is not the main character. The main character is Jimmy, played by Jason Segel. And Jimmy is in the midst of some real pain. And he is not doing a great job coping with it. But he continues to see his patients. And in one montage of sessions with these clients, sessions he is doing his best to remain alert for, it's clear that the patients have been wrestling with the same issues for years. One has a variety of phobias and compulsions. One is lonely, but pathologically avoids the risks of relationship. And one is struggling with the power differential in her marriage. And from the look on Jimmy's face, he is listening. It's clear from these sessions that they are kind of a hamster wheel of processing and little change in the client's lives. And the montage wraps up with one woman speaking about the troubles in her marriage. And Jimmy is listening, but he appears frustrated hearing the same issues, reasons, and excuses. And as far as therapeutic ethics are concerned, he snaps. He interrupts her and says, "Your husband is emotionally abusive. Leave him, or I won't be your therapist anymore." And as you can imagine, the remaining episodes deal with the wisdom or folly of, as well as the long-term effects of this approach. Instead of allowing the client to have their autonomy and their agency in directing the process, he intervenes and he tries to interrupt his client's underlying and controlling issues. And as you might suspect, things go awry, and the show's real focus is on Jimmy's underlying issues and how they are controlling him. And in some ways, Romans 6 is kind of like Paul saying to his church people, just stop doing those things that are controlling and hurting you. Sin is emotionally, spiritually, and physically abusive. Leave it. And hearing that, I imagine you have the same response I did this week. Whoa, settle down. You're coming on a little too strong. And I was definitely a little put off by Paul's approach as I began to prepare this week, but eventually I gained a sense of empathy for Paul. Kind of like Jimmy growing tired of seeing his patients flounder. For Paul, as a pastor, as a person concerned with the flourishing and well-being of his people, I'm sure it broke his heart to see the people in his care continue to make poor choices. I'm sure he was sad and mad at seeing the same old habits turn their lives asunder. I'm sure he just wanted to scream, just stop doing that thing. And I'm sure Paul had to come back to the hard truth that people are not that simple. As his imagery in this section says, people are obedient to their controlling issues and habits. And it requires either something very powerful or a lot of hard work to break those habits. I know that. Paul knows that. You know that. Jimmy from Shrinking knows that. But still, when you're on the outside looking in, when you are so invested in the well-being of another person, sometimes you just want to scream, just let that thing die. I want you to be free from its grip on your life. And to Paul's way of thinking, something very powerful is available to his people and to us. In Romans 6, Paul believes and argues that the old habits and behaviors can die with Christ. He believes that by participating in the death of Christ, we can gain freedom from sin and its power over us. And before we go any further, let's define our terms. Sin is a two-part definition. For Paul and for any good theologian, there are little s, lowercase s sins. These are choices, actions, harmful behaviors. And then there is capital S, sin. Sin, the underlying problem, the power, the belief, the worldview. Uppercase sin is that unseen motivator of lowercase sins. So Paul, Jesus, God, the gospel seeks to deal with the underlying issues causing harmful behavior. And as any good therapist knows, behaviors are best changed when we get to the underlying problem or issue. So Paul wants to get to the root of the problem for his people. He wants them to flourish and finally be free from their old sin behaviors. But for them to flourish and live sin, uppercase S sin, needs to die. And so he uses the binary language of death and life to distinguish their life before and after Jesus. And verses 1 through 11 contain this beautiful and profound description of the gospel power of baptism. And we read it every year on Easter Vigil. Paul sees their baptism as a pivotal moment in their lives. For Paul, the plunge underwater is his people joining with Christ in his death, and them emerging from the water is joining Christ in his resurrection. So, having said this in the previous 11 verses, Paul wants them to live that way in verses 12 through 23. Live as if you are dead to sin. Live as if you are raised to new life. Why would you go back to those old harmful ways? You are free from the dominion of sin. Leave the dominion of your husband. He's emotionally abusive. Now, that last one is from Jimmy from Shrinking, not Paul. But it's provocative language. It's upsetting language. But I have come to believe that it is rooted in love. So this week, my first step in approaching this passage was appreciating where Paul is coming from. He's a pastor dealing with pastoral issues and trying to invigorate his people with liberating theology. He wants to see his people thrive. He wants to see them truly live. And so he puts things bluntly in verses 12 and 13. Since you died to sin with Christ, don't let sin rule your body. Since you died to sin with Christ, don't obey sin's passions as they manifest in your body. Since you died to sin with Christ, stop letting your body be used as a weapon of wickedness. And this is where Paul reminds me of Jimmy from Shrinking. Just stop doing that thing. Make a big dramatic break and be done. And that kind of language would be a problem if Paul wasn't also encouraging them at the same time. Because just 4 verses later, he points to God's work in them already. He writes, "Thanks be to God that you, having once been slaves to sin, have become obedient from the heart to the form of teaching entrusted to you. And that you, having been set free from sin, have become slaves of righteousness." In his heart, he can see God at work in their lives. And because of this, it breaks his heart to see them regress back into old habits and behaviors and ways of thinking. Have you had this experience with people? It's always so easy to see when it's another person, isn't it? a person so down on themselves, but you can see their beauty, and you just wish they could see it and believe it. A person who has dealt a really bad hand in life, but slowly has gained perspective and new habits. But then every once in a while, those old habits come back, and it breaks your heart. So Paul has this firm belief that the power of the gospel, the death and resurrection of Jesus, is strong enough to break that cycle. And he wants his people to experience it and truly live. And again, as a way toward empathy and understanding Paul, he has this firm belief in this dramatic binary conversion type moment because he had a dramatic conversion moment. And then he changed his name from Saul to Paul. You'll remember in Acts, as he's touring around persecuting Christians, on his way to Damascus, he's blinded by a light from the sky, and the resurrected Jesus speaks to him and asks, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" And then Ananias is sent by Jesus to pray for Saul, and then in another dramatic turn, the scales fall off his eyes, and he sees physically and spiritually, and he becomes a defender of the very church he is persecuting. So, it's no wonder that he has a binary worldview of life before and after Jesus. And now, he does have some sense of the process of becoming what Christ has in mind for his church people, but it's rooted in what biblical scholars call an apocalyptic sense of conversion. Apocalyptic meaning something is revealed that changes everything. Saul is dead. Paul is now alive, and so it follows he wants his people to have a similar understanding of themselves. And I have feelings about that kind of, shall we say, projection. But I guess what I'm saying, what I'm trying to do to first is be gracious to Paul. Because he himself says in verse 14, "You are not under law, but under grace." But man, he makes some tough word choices. I suspect you are squirming at Paul's central theme and imagery in this passage, the imagery of slavery and the call to be obedient. And I don't think this phrase will catch on or be a t-shirt in 2023. Be obedient like a slave. Don't invest your money in that slogan. I think verse 22 is the most problematic and confusing because Paul writes, "But now you have been freed from sin and enslaved to God." Don't worry. Be encouraged. You are enslaved. You have been freed into slavery. To be freed into slavery is an odd liberation. And it's odd. It's really odd because later in chapter 8, Paul writes, and he kind of contradicts himself, "For you did not receive a spirit of slavery to fall back into fear. You didn't receive a spirit of slavery, but a spirit of adoption." Well, which is it? Slavery or adoption? What is Paul doing here? And the answer is hard for us in the 21st century because Paul's real interest is that other word, obedience. He doesn't want his people to become mindless slaves. Slavery is not the fulcrum of his imagery. He uses the imagery of slavery because a slave or a servant obeys. Obedience is the point he is making. And that word is probably triggering for you. Obedience smacks of mindless subservience, right? Dictators and tyrants demand obedience. Perhaps for you, a domineering parent demanded obedience. Unjust laws or systems demand obedience. Decades past, postmodernism, we are suspicious of anyone or anything demanding our obedience. Now, this is a tangent. I don't have a clear point here because I'm still processing. But again, today, reflecting on the involuntary removal of Awaken Church from the ECC for their welcoming of members of the LGBT community similar to ours. It feels like that a demanding, domineering obedience is coming down from that body. And I'm sure it feels like for people in the LGBT community as if they're being forced into a stifling obedience. All that to say, obedience is not a comfortable term for us. But at the same time, every time I drive through a busy intersection, I'm very thankful that that driver of the 16-wheeler truck obeyed the traffic law. I'm glad he obeyed the red light. Otherwise, I'd be dead. I'm mortally grateful for that person's obedience in that case. So on some level, obedience helps hold society together. Obedience needs some context. What am I being asked to obey, and why, and for what end, and for what good? He never says it quite this clearly, but I think Paul is saying we are freed from sin. And we are freed into and freed for grace. We are freed from obedience to sin, and we are freed into and for obedience to grace. How does it sound? How does it make you feel to be obedient to Christ-like grace? I think if we're honest, obedience is actually a key factor in our psychology. Because of our development, our culture, our family of origin, we have a programmed or unconscious obedience. We behave or process our world and our relationships in a particular way because we have subconsciously learned these behaviors. And in this way, we are obedient to our subconsciousness or our habits. And until we question or poke at why we behave the way we do, we remain obedient. And Paul knows this. And he's actually honest about his own struggle in chapter 7, which again helps me empathize with him more. He writes, "I do not understand my own actions, for I do not do what I want, but do the very thing I hate." I don't do what I want, I do the very thing I hate. Paul wrestles with his inner and contradicting obediences. And he eventually comes to rely on the power of the grace of Christ. And I can relate to this. In some parallel ways, I can truly empathize with Paul. I understand doing the thing you don't want to do because I'm still processing an email I recently wrote and later came to regret. So as a literal parallel, as I analyzed Paul's letter to the church in Rome, I trembled and I sympathized with Paul. I thought, good God, I hope no one ever tries to analyze my correspondence as if it's sacred text. And that's not to say I don't think God is speaking through Paul's writing, but gosh, that is a lot of pressure. I'll spare you the details of this story, but it actually fits as an example of this contradicting obedience, because in this email, my intention was to help clarify the relational strain for a family member and talk about next steps. I wanted to help. But in the end, thanks to the gracious ear of a friend and colleague, I came to realize my blind spot. A shadow side I had known about for years, because another power or obedience had taken over the content of that email. Because despite my efforts and my personal training, my letter, as I reflected on it, was just dripping with pride. My blind spot. Upon rereading it, I saw clearly just how pride was my master. Despite my intentions, I was obedient to that old friend, pride. And I imagine pride in the corner giggling as I wrote and reread and rewrote and sent that email, just kind of giggling. God. But here is the good news. Grace. Grace freed me to realize what I had done. Grace met me in the ears and questions of a friend. Grace freed me to revisit my words, to grieve the wound I had made with my pride, and grace humbled me to admit my mistake. Grace freed me to see how I was unwittingly subservient to pride and self-righteousness. Grace freed me to apologize and ask forgiveness of the recipient of that email. Eventually, I became obedient to grace. For you are not under law, but under grace. Just days away from our nation's celebrating its independence, there will be lots of talk of freedom. But there is freedom from, and there is freedom for. The United States sought freedom from tyranny and taxes without representation in British Parliament. The American people often define freedom as freedom from any restriction on us. And there are real injustices and oppressive forces that we should be free from. But the real power of the American vision is imagining and reshaping what freedom is for. What are we free for? What is the goal of our freedom? For the Christian, an identity that should precede any national or political allegiance. We are freed from sin by grace, and we are freed for a new life under grace. We are freed for grace. We are freed to welcome more and more of God's dearly beloved people into grace. We are freed by grace so that our unconscious obedience can be made plain. We are freed so that we can choose a new and more life-giving kind of obedience. We are freed from obedience to sin and death. And we are freed for obedience to grace for life. Thanks be to God.